Hi, welcome back to Project Management. This is Professor Murray. Today's lecture is on procurement. Procurement, it's another word for purchasing or for buying things. In projects, we don't just buy things, we buy services, we buy materials, we buy a lot of things. So here we go with procurement. First, let's take a look at some of the typical steps to building something like a project. We start out, we have a charter, and that's where we come up with our objectives, our budget, our overall plan, and basically what needs to be accomplished. Then we have some design activities where maybe some drawings are produced, specifications are written, permits are taken out. Then we need to get materials. We buy raw materials, we might buy products like a bandsaw or a car or a computer system. So different products, and we also hire or purchase equipment that'll be used to construct the project or maybe become part of the project. Then we have our installation period where things are built, either construction is done or a machine is built, utilities are installed, and testing is eventually done. And lastly, we have our closeout, where we do startup, we do training, compile our lessons learned, and then get on to the next project. Okay, so we have different stages to the project. Let's take a look at some ways to go about accomplishing those. This one is a design build project, also known as a turnkey. And it's called turnkey because you hire someone to, for example, build you a house, and they do everything until the point where they turn the key over to you. In this case, the owner or the sponsor, they would do the objectives, their overall budget, overall plan, and then they would hire someone to do all of the remaining components. That they would contract the design, buying the materials, doing the installation, starting up the equipment. In this next example, a build to print, or build per design is another way to call it. In this example, the owner or maybe the owner's engineers or engineers that they hire would do all the initial work with chartering the project, doing the design, and then they would hire someone that does the physical part. They would hire a contractor or a production company to acquire the materials and do the work and build the product or do the installation according to the design that's given to them. And then here's another example. This is maybe for a larger project. In this example, the owner does things throughout the project, and they hire different organizations or different firms to do different parts of it. In this example, they might hire someone to come up with their overall plan for them. If it's a very large project, they want concepts developed by maybe an architectural firm. Then they might hire a different group to do drawings and specifications. And then buying materials, buying products, renting or purchasing equipment, that might all come from different contractors or different suppliers. Construction might be done by another group, and even training might be contracted out. So in this example, they've hired 6 or 8 different unique entities or unique firms to work on their project. In the previous 2, they've hired 1 or 2 firms to do major parts. So very different ways to go about doing the project, even though all the steps are essentially the same. Let's look at the procurement process for a minute. Here we've got 8 steps, and they start with requirements are defined, then bids are obtained, the options would be evaluated, then a contract or purchase order is issued, the work and material is produced, the asset is received, an invoice is issued to the owner, and then the bill is paid. So basic steps in the process. Now let's look at a few ways to, we're kind of looking at this part right here where we're obtaining bids. There's different ways to do that. Here's 3. These are procurement strategies with quotes, or where the price is known up front. The first is request for proposal, and that might be with this option, you would ask for a proposal to do your project. The firm that's giving you a proposal knows how to do the design. They come up with the design and they do the kind of the whole job for you. So that's a request for proposal. Request for quotation, that's more when the design is already established and the engineering specifications have all been done. Requirements are known and different firms can give firm proposals or firm quotations based on those requirements. The third, which is probably not as common, is a request for information. You're not asking the supplier to give you a firm commitment or firm price, but you're asking what can be done or budget pricing or concept proposals. So you're asking just for information that later is going to be firmed up. Now there's also procurement without quotes, and there's a few ways to go about that. First is cost plus, and this is mostly used in government contracts. It's very nice for suppliers to be able to use cost plus, because any cost that they have with producing your product, they get to charge you that, and then they get to add their plus, which is their profit and overhead. There's should be no way for them to lose money when they're doing it that strategy, unless of course they don't keep good track of their costs. The other one is time and material, and that's often used with partnerships where you know a firm that you work with frequently, and rather than having them give you a quotation on how much the job will be, you have them come and do the work and they charge you for their time and for their materials. Obviously, there's a level of trust that's needed. Getting a fair price. There's a few ways to go about it. The first is with competitive bids. It's common to get 3 bids on everything you buy. Another is a negotiated price. And this is more when you're dealing with a unique firm. If you're buying a nuclear reactor, for example, there's not a lot of different vendors that can do that work for you. So probably you would negotiate the price with the contractor rather than getting different bids on it. The third is, it's less common, but there's this cost disclosure. And that's kind of like cost plus, where the supplier shares all of their costs with the buyer, and the buyer can audit those numbers and those costs and decide if it's a fair price. There's partnerships, which is often tied to the time and material type strategy. And then there's long-term pricing contracts, where you set up a contract with a supplier that they'll provide a service for you at a certain price, and that price will be set. For example, if you rent a forklift several times during the year, you might have a long-term pricing contract with a forklift rental company where they charge you a fixed known price each time you need to rent that forklift. Let's go back to the process, and I've highlighted a few things here. These are the items that are legal documents. The contract or the purchase order, that's a legal document. But if we look back here at, say, defining the requirements and getting bids or getting quotes, those are not really legal documents. Those are more information. But once a contract is established, that's a legal document. It's an agreement between 2 parties, and it's enforceable by law. The next one that's a legal contract is at some point the asset is received. Either the product is shipped to the site, or something is built, or somehow an asset transfers from a previous owner to a new owner. And often there's documents that go with that, such as a bill of material that gets sent with the product that's shipped. And then third, there's an invoice that comes from the supplier to the owner or to the project manager. And the finance people call this a three-way match. They need to match the contract, what was agreed upon, the receiving documents, what was actually delivered, and then the invoice, that's the request for payment. Finance people want to match those three items together, make sure that everything agrees, and once it does, then they go ahead and process their payment. Lastly, what can go wrong? Lots of things can go wrong when you're buying. The first is lack of detail. If you don't give enough detail for what you want, you might not get what you're expecting. Somewhat less common is too much detail. If you are buying a simple product and you produce pages and pages of specifications for what that product should be, then whoever's supplying that is probably not going to be very interested in doing business with you. Next is changes to the scope or changes to the schedule. When you enter a contract, you have an agreement with how much money is going to be charged, what is going to be produced, and when it's going to be produced. When you change any of those things, less than ideal results can emerge. The third is corruption. So there's lots of ways for things to be corrupted. Products might be produced that are not as promised. You might expect to be buying something that's good quality and you end up receiving something that's poor quality or broken or doesn't function. Sometimes there's kickbacks. That's where people accept money from a supplier in order to influence the purchasing decision. There's also non-payment, where a buyer receives a product and they don't pay their supplier, or they delay payments. And last, of course, is material or product defects. In project management, material and product defects are typically the least common problem that's going to occur. The most common are lack of detail, changes to the scope, and corruption. Those are all very common. Okay, that's it for procurement. Thanks for listening.